So I think he's vice chair for the conservative movement.
Ah, yes. All right, there we go. I think everything is up and running now the way it's supposed to be. Let's just make sure that it's going.
So I just got his name. It's Jazar Hess. Do you know who that is?
Not off the top of my head. I'll have to look him up. But good. I'm glad if people are coming to discuss that topic. All right, we are looking at 7:02. And I think that's our cue to get started. See how much we can do from chapter 6 for this evening. So thank you all for joining me, whether you're there by Zoom, whether you're there by YouTube, or whether you're watching this as a recording. We are picking up now in chapter 6, Mishnah number 1, and we are continuing our conversation about some odd issues with different mikvaot. We have talked about different ways that the water can be added or joined. And now we're going to talk about the joining of a water, which is near a mikveh, but is not officially part of the mikveh. And let's get some Mishnah on the table, and then we'll see what they mean. Anything which is joined with a mikveh is like a mikveh. Okay, what do we mean by joined? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a body of water, a collection of water that is not a mikveh itself. It's smaller than 40 seahs. It's smaller than that minimum size, but it is somehow linked, and that's what we're going to clarify. So in your mind, you can imagine a straight mikveh itself, nice chamber, collection of water, more than 40 seahs, great. And then next to it, there is another hole. Now, it's not a 40 seahs hole. It's, it's much smaller. And there is some connection between that hole and the mikveh itself. Now, even if that hole is not big enough for the immersion of a whole person, if it is big enough to immerse other things in, and it's joined to the mikveh to the extent that it will count as a mikveh, then that becomes a handy secondary immersion point for things that'll fit in it. So if we can find how it joins, hey, that's great. And especially in the ancient world, where people would often be dealing with oddly shaped natural formations, or even unusual fit it where you can man-made constructions for the mikveh, this sort of exception could be useful. All right, so what could this be like where it's a collection that is joined and it thus counts as a mikveh? Well, one may immerse in holes of a cavern and in crevices of a cavern just as they are. So our first example is we have our mikveh itself, and in the edge of the mikveh, this is the downward view, in the edge of the mikveh, there's a little crack that comes off to the side. So some of the water works its way into that crack. Or imagine that there is a hole that is carved out of one corner of the mikveh, and some of the water goes in there, and that hole is still considered part of the mikveh. The water in the hole, the water in the crevice is still kosher. Use it for mikveh purposes, and you're great. And the important caveat that's here is that, as we'll see in the contrast in our next line, is that even if those areas are connected by a tiny, tiny sliver of a crack, then it can still be considered a kosher mikveh. The technical phrase, as we saw, I believe back in chapter 4, is the hole the size of the tube of a water skin, of a water flask kind of container. That in this case, where it's the side holes and crevices, as long as there is any connection at all, then it is fine. But part 3, the pit of a cavern, one may not immerse in it unless it had a hole as big as the tube of water skin. All right, now, this is a little bit more difficult to imagine. And the different examples that I've seen in commentary are basically talking about a extension of the mikveh, or a hole near the mikveh that goes under the mikveh to some extent, or is built next to the mikveh in such a way that the bottom of the mikveh forms a barrier to it, but also part of its construction shape. So imagine a two-story mikveh, if you will, where there is a chamber under the main mikveh. Now I'm going sideways. There's a chamber down here, and that chamber has an offshoot that comes all the way up to the surface, but at that surface point, it is not connected anywhere along the wall to the mikveh itself. Its only connection is at the bottom of the mikveh. So the water would go in, the water will fill, of course, it'll flow down into the bottom chamber, that second story, and then it will fill back up along the side, as water does when you are filling up a space. Okay, if that is the case, that you have this sort of two-story mikveh with the side tunnel coming out of it, then you can't immerse in the primary, the secondary offshoot, unless where they connect in that bottom part has a hole in it as big as the tube of a water skin. We'll get back to that whole dimensions later, but that is required. So there's a different stringency at the bottom than it is compared to the side. And that's because between the bottom and the under chamber, there is this barrier that is of sufficient width that the floor of the mikveh hasn't just collapsed. And that means we're actually dealing with basically a partition as opposed to just a crack or crevice or hole. And so that puts it up into a secondary status until we can establish that the water that's connecting them is traveling through this slightly larger opening. Now we're going to clarify that even more. At least most commentaries consider this to be a clarification, not an argument, with the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is this a case? When it stands by itself, meaning when that separating barrier between them is stable. But if it does not stand by itself, then one may immerse in it in that offshoot just as it is. So if you have a mikveh where the bottom is about to collapse because there's this dugout area underneath it, and that dugout area is connected to a chamber along the edge of the mikveh, but not connected to the mikveh during that side, then Rabbi Yehuda clarifies that you can go ahead and use the side chamber just fine, because that partition between the upper and lower levels is not really a partition, because it's about to collapse at any moment. If you step at the bottom of the mikveh, you're just going to fall through the floor right into that lower chamber. That's not a separate container or vessel or collection, better word. That's basically an extension that just doesn't know it is yet. So that is an additional clarification of what kind of separation are we talking about before we care about the diameter of the connecting channel between the two bodies of water. Okay, questions or comments? Okay, so that is the details of what it's like when you have a separate chamber, meaning you've got an offshoot of the mikveh. What happens if you put a separate chamber into the mikveh? This is the next step in our discussion. Mishnah 2. If a bucket was full of utensils and they were immersed, they become clean. Okay, so some clarification needed here in order to make sense of this, at least according to the way it's relayed into Jewish law. So first of all, a bucket in general was a more closed top item. And that means that we're dealing here not with a big wide bucket like we're used to, but more of an actual somewhat protected container. So you've got that, and you've filled it up full of your knives and forks and other things that need to be immersed in order to be rendered ritually pure. The unspoken part here is that the bucket itself also needs to be ritually pure. And that means that as you are lowering it into it, you are doing two jobs at once. That you are lowering the bucket in to make it ritually pure, which means that the inside of the bucket has to also fill with water. So you've lowered the bucket into the water enough that the water can now spill in. Well, even though the mouth of the bucket is narrower than the tube of the water skin that we've been talking about, because we need the water to go in, and because we will this will render the bucket itself as being ritually pure, then we can make the correlated assumption that the items inside are now immersed in the waters of the mikvah, that there is a continuous linkage between the water inside the bucket and the water outside the bucket, because that was the whole point of immersing the bucket in the first place. If we couldn't make that assumption, then no container like this would ever be rendered ritually pure, because we would always say, the mouth is too small. There's no way that it's been able to connect with the water outside. Even if some dribbled in, that's not enough. Even if it's full, it wasn't a continuous connection. Well, obviously, we're going to still render these items ritually pure. Therefore, we have to treat the water coming into it, even through this narrow opening, as being connected to the greater mikvah around it. Therefore, anything inside of the bucket is rendered ritually pure as well, even if it has a smaller opening than usually required. However, if the bucket was not immersed, meaning if we were not immersing the bucket for the purpose of ritual purification, then the water in the bucket is not considered as joined, meaning with the rest of the water of the mikvah, unless it be joined by means of a hole in the bucket, which is as big as the tube of a water skin. So if you are putting the bucket in, and either you're not putting all the bucket in, or in the more the commentary's view, you're not immersing it for the purpose of ritual purification of the bucket itself, then we do not make the assumption that the water will penetrate to all corners, and thus we need a larger hole to say that this bucket is not a barrier to the water reaching the utensils that are within the bucket, but instead there is a clear enough channel to allow the buckets to be considered part of the mikvah and not a barrier intruding between the waters and the utensils. Okay, so I know there's a lot of hidden assumptions in that. It's the way the Mishnah talks. It uses few words to say a lot. Sometimes we wish it had more words, and that's one of the reasons why we end up with not only commentary, but the Talmud itself. All right. Any questions then on Mishnah number 2?
So, Rabbi, it's my understanding if the bucket's completely immersed and water can get in, that's good enough. But if it's not completely immersed, there just has to be a hole in the bucket the size of a water skin where water can get in. Is that correct?
So that is the sort of basic understanding, but the assumption of why that's the case in the discussion of the Talmud is that it is because the bucket is actually going in to be immersed itself. And so we are more lenient when it needs to be immersed, because otherwise, how can such a bucket ever be ritually purified? But if it's not needing to be immersed, if it is just already ritually pure and we're just immersing it with these new utensils in it, then we wouldn't make that assumption, and thus we would need a larger channel for the water to be considered joined to the rest of the mikvah, rather than in a container, rather than drawn water, which would always be an issue. We don't want the water as it enters the bucket to now be considered separate from the rest of the mikvah and drawn from it. We need it to be linked, and that's why we need a larger hole.
But didn't we previously go over stuff, and I know it was with flowing water, but where the flowing water would go over a vessel?
We did, but that was the flowing water from a mayan, from a spring. And this is in a mikvah, which doesn't have the same status as that spring. It's not quite as resilient as the flowing water of a spring. All right, let's take a look then at Mishnah number 3. All right, picture, if you will, mind's eye, 3 mikvahs. Well, at least they want to be a mikvah when they grow up. Each of the 3 chambers has 20 seahs. Now, 2 of the chambers have 20 seahs of proper water. We'll just call it rainwater for the moment to make it easy. We've got 2 that have rainwater in it, each containing 20 seahs. Now, if they combined, boom, 40 seahs, that's our minimum for the mikvah. The 3rd chamber, however, has 20 seahs, but this is of drawn water. And as we all know, drawn water does not make a mikvah. And certainly if it's only got 20 seahs of drawn water, that's past the 3 log of maximum drawn water. It can never be a kosher mikvah until we drain it. So even if we poured another 20 seahs of rainwater into that 3rd one, it's not kosher. That's the basic understanding if we consider each one of these 3 as being separate, a separate mikvaot. But we are about to do a sleight of hand, a little magic trick, and we are going to combine them together. But first, we're going to have to look at 2 different versions to understand when that will work and when that won't. In the first version, which will be successful, we have mikvah A, which has rainwater, mikvah B, which has rainwater, and mikvah C, which has drawn water. So 1 and 2 are on their way to being filled in a kosher manner. Number 3 is just holding water and is not going to be a mikvah. Okay, if 3 people go down, they each go into the mikvah and they immerse themselves in them. So each one is getting in, and as we know by the laws of displacement for water, when a person gets into the water has to get out of the way. And that means that even though there were only 20 seahs in each of them, the water is going to come up around their bodies and it will join at the surface level. So you have to imagine like putting 3 people into these 3 big cups, these big glasses, and when they each push down, the water comes up, and at the surface level, the water is going to hit the water coming out of its neighbor. So it's going to join. So we got our 3 surfaces here. I wish, I don't know, can I make my knuckles even? Close enough. Anyway, we got our 3 surface of the mikvaot here, and the water comes up and it all begins to run together at the top. So now we've got 60 seahs of water total with 3 tubes going down from the shared puddle at the top of the mikvah. Everybody got the vision? Good. If that's how it happened, 3 people going down, mikvah 1, mikvah 2 have kosher rainwater, mikvah 3 just has drawn water. Then when the water comes up around their bodies, when they go in simultaneously, that water becomes joined, the mikvahs are clean, and they that immerse themselves become clean. So all 3 of the mikvaot do the job of a mikvah. They render the people in them pure, and all 3 of them are now considered to be proper mikvah water, even after the 3 people leave. Even after their waters go down and they're no longer joined at the top, each of the 3, 1, 2, and 3, are now considered to be containing valid mikvah water. Still 20 seahs or less, depending upon how much water went with the person when they left, but the water in each one of them could be then filled up again with rainwater, and all 3 of them could potentially become kosher mikvaot in their own right. And of course, if they join, it's fine again as well. So what's going on here? Well, because we have the mikvah water at the edge, then the attitude towards this is that as the waters join, the mikvah waters from mikvahs 1 and 2, which have the kosher rainwater in them, are combining to make 40 seahs of mikvah water, and then the 20 seahs of the extra drawn water is added to them. But once they've become 40, that's already valid. And that means that even though it's being mixed together at the same time, thus the simultaneity of the issue, we can still say that that third one is not disrupting the process, because the two that are side by side are joining, and that is sufficient for calling the entire apparatus a combined kosher space. We're going to see a flip side of that in the second half, but I want to make sure we've got the picture right. The theory we can still talk about once we see the flip, but I just want to make sure everybody's understanding the mechanics. Just as you're maybe formulating a question, I'll just remind that everybody would agree, and there'd be no question at all, that if two people went into mikvahs 1 and 2 with the rainwater, made them join, and then a third person came in later and added their 20 sayas to the first two, there wouldn't be any question at all. Of course, that's kosher. We don't need to say that in this Mishnah. The chiddush, the novelty of this Mishnah, is that when it happens all at the same time, nonetheless, it is considered a kosher mikvah altogether for all three. Okay, let's take a look at how this wouldn't work. What could we change that would make this not work? Well, if the one holding the drawn water was in the middle, so we have mikvah 1, rainwater, mikvah 2, drawn water, mikvah 3, rainwater. So now the two rainwaters are not next to each other. Then in that case, 3 persons went down and immersed themselves in the water of the 3 mikvahs, which then joins. The mikvahs continue as they were before, and they that immersed themselves are as they were before. So the waters come up, we get our giant puddle at the top that connects to the 3 tubes, but because we have that middle block of drawn water, it prevents the 2 on the side, the 1 and 3 in this case, from incontrovertibly mixing, because we're not sure exactly how its water is interacting with them. And that means that there is the possibility that they are not properly binding together to create the giant super mitzvah, the mikvah, the Voltron of Mikvaot. And that means if you were ritually impure before you went in, you are ritually impure when you leave. The other novelty, however, is that the mikvahs themselves, 1, 2, and 3, even after the people leave, will be considered as being rainwater, drawn water, rainwater, just as they were before we started. So there is enough of a doubt here that we're not going to overrule their status of the mikvaot, but there is also enough of a doubt that we are not going to overrule the status of those that went down for purification. Yes, Aaron.
So since we're dealing with doubt, how can we apply the leniency? Because this is still, is this Rabbanan or Dirata?
So this is technically in this situation a D'Rabbanan issue. So the issue of drawn water not being sufficient for a proper mikvah is considered to be a D'Rabbanan stringency, and therefore the various adjustments when drawn water enters the equation are stringencies that are rabbinic, which means when there is doubt, we are going to usually err on the side of more leniency. Here, however, there is just too much doubt, with the middle one being the drawn water mikvah, and thus we cannot institute that level of leniency.
Yeah, no, the big issue I had is how come the middle one didn't invalidate the other two? Because it looks like they're kind of mixing.
Well, yeah, they are definitely joined, which is sort of a synonym for mixing, but we don't know exactly how much joined. We don't actually have a flow meter to check whether 3 logs went left or 3 logs went right or 10 logs went this way or that way, and thus we are not going to invalidate the mikvaot. We're also not going to validate them, because we likewise don't have a flow meter telling us that the 2 rainwater mikvaot somehow joined successfully more than mixing with that middle one. So we also cannot be super lenient on this issue either. It's just start over again. All right. Now, having talked about our drawn water, we need to have a little bit of a talk that what do we do with these items that might have drawn water in them that go into the mikveh itself? So we're not actually saying that I'm putting it in, but it's going in or at least touching. Well, if a sponge or a bucket containing 3 loaves of water fell into a mikveh, they do not make it invalid, because they have only said if 3 loaves fell in. So meaning that the issue here is whether or not the actual 3 loaves are what is falling in, not whether the thing containing the 3 loaves fell in. So if you drop in a sponge that had drawn water on it, then you would pull the sponge out and not consider that to have invalidated the mikveh. Again, we're talking about a mikveh before it has reached its 40 seah state. Likewise, you put a bucket in, and the bucket is not actually connected to the rest of the water, even though, yes, there might have been some transference, just like with the dampness of the sponge. We don't consider that to have been joined with the rest of the mikveh officially, and therefore we remove it, and it's not an issue. Again, remember, a bucket here is different than our conception of a modern bucket. Now, you may be wondering, however, well, what happens if I have a bucket and I need to purify it? And what happens when I go to remove the water? If the mikveh only had 40 seahs and I go to remove my bucket, won't I be taking too much water with it? Or even more alarmingly, won't I be drawing water out of the mikveh? And when it sloshes back into the mikveh, won't that now be considered drawn water? And if the mikveh was only just 40 seahs when I first went in, then that means it was under 40 seahs when I pulled it out, and the drawn water would invalidate it if it was more than 3 loaves. Well, we've got you covered. I came across this in the commentary, and it's just too good not to share. The answer is, when you take your bucket out, take it upside down, so that anything that's inside leaves the bucket and goes into or stays in the mikveh as you draw it out of the mikveh itself. Then it will not be considered drawn water when it returns, or rather maintains, its connection to the mikveh. Just a little bit of additional mikveh trivia. Mishnah number 5. Excuse me, I'm just getting a little hoarse, so I want to get a little more tea. All right, so we've had buckets, we've had sponges, we've had side chambers and crevices and cracks. Let's make it a little bit larger than that. A chest or a box which is in the sea. All right, I've got a nice big box, and I put it in the ocean, and I want to use it for my mikveh. I want to use it as a chamber to be able to put things into, because I don't want to just drop them into the ocean, because, well, that's a good way to lose your stuff. One may not immerse in them unless they have a hole as large as the tube of a water skin. So this chest that goes into the ocean can work as a sub-chamber of the ocean if there was a hole in it that's big enough that the water that's flowing into it and out of it is considered joined to the ocean itself. So even though I've got this container, it's not really a container. It's just kind of a fence for a portion of the ocean right now. And yes, that's a useful fence for me, because I get to use it as a subset of the ocean for immersion in a way that I won't lose things. But because this hole is big enough, it is considered to be part of the ocean more than its own container. Note that if it had a smaller hole, then that would not be true. If it was just gently leaking, and even if it then filled up completely from the ocean, that would not be sufficient for it to act as a chamber of the ocean. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. In the case of a large vessel, meaning a vessel that could be considered a mikveh all on its own, a hole should be 4 handbreadths, 4 tfachim, which is much, much larger. And in a small one, the hole should be as large as the greater part of it, meaning that there needs to be a very large proportion of it to say that this is only a subchamber of the ocean. that a tiny hole that's just, yay big is insufficient for considering this part of the ocean. Now, Rabbi Yehuda loses this argument, but he was worried that if we're going to create this sub-chamber, it needs to be more connected than just by a small hole. The rabbis, on the other hand, say, no, the small hole, well, smallish, is the benchmark that we have used generally for joining water, and we're going to continue that rule here. In part 2, we get a different type of container. If there was a sack or a basket, well, this is different. Sacks and baskets, especially in the ancient world, but even in our own modern world, are known to be basically water permeable. We're not talking about some waterproof, special nylon treated chemical sack in which you put for your backpacking. This is your good old burlap sack kind of sack. And those are basically considered not waterproof. Likewise, a basket may be woven quite tightly, but really, it's unless you have treated it in some special way, is not going to be considered waterproof either. So you submerge this into the ocean and you want to then immerse in it. One may immerse in them as they are. No special holes are needed. Just the sack, just the basket is fine, since the water is mixed together. That is perfectly fine. It is not considered a separate container. Likewise, if they are placed under a water spout, they do not make the mikvah invalid. So if we have our water spout and we put a sack at the bottom of it for whatever crazy reason we may have, or might be a valid reason in the ancient world, I don't know because I don't live back then, it doesn't count as a container. If we put a barrel under the water spout, then the water in that barrel is definitely collected, like we talked about in previous Mishnayot, except for a few exceptions. But if we put it as a basket or a sack, then that water is not considered to be in a vessel, and thus it is not considered drawn water. And if that water ends up going into the mikvah, it will not invalidate it. And then one little extra bit, which is similar to what I described in the last Mishnah, and they may be immersed and brought up in the ordinary way. Unlike the bucket I described in the last one that has to be brought up upside down in order not to be drawing out of it with a vessel and thus allowing the water to flush back in from a drawn system. The water that leaks back out of a sack, that leaks back out of a basket, is not going to invalidate the mikvah as being drawn water. So the sack and the basket basically don't count as containers if we are talking about the water that goes into a mikvah. Questions or comments? Okay. Mishnah 6. If there was a broken earthenware vessel in the mikvah. All right. Here we have a complicated interconnection of many things. So an earthenware vessel has a very special status in Jewish law when it comes to purification issues. An earthenware vessel will not only render something ritually impure from being in contact with it, but an earthenware vessel, think like terracotta, will render something impure by being in the airspace of that vessel. Now, that is a slight, that we're going to see there are some slight variations on that, but that's the general rule we're going to start off on, and we'll make it more complicated when we have to. So here we have a big pot that we have sunk into the mikveh itself, but the broken shards at the top are poking up around the top of the water. So 90% of it or whatever is sunken into the water, but some of it is sticking out. Now, since the vessel itself has not been fully immersed and couldn't become ritually pure in any event, but since it's not fully immersed, the impurity of its shards are still creating an airspace issue beyond the surface of the water. Keep that in mind as we read. If there was a broken earthenware vessel in the mikveh and utensils were immersed in it, they become clean from their former uncleanness, but are again rendered unclean because of the earthenware vessel. So imagine I put my fork into the water that is inside this earthenware vessel. Well, that broken and thus connected vessel is going to immerse my fork and join with the waters of the mikveh, and presto changeo, it is ritually pure. While it's in the water, it's the job has been done. But as I extract it from the water, and I'm still within the radius of the airspace of the earthenware vessel, as it comes up, the water that is on the fork becomes contaminated by the ritual uncleanness of the earthenware vessel, and the item itself becomes ritually contaminated by the water that is on it. So we are now in trouble. You can put it in and make it clean, but the second you pull it out, it's rendered impure again. The airspace still does the negative job of rendering something tameh. But there's a solution. If water flowed above it in any quantity, they are clean. If you have submerged the vessel to an extent that all of its little jagged pieces are covered by water, even if it's just by a tiniest hair's breadth, the thickness of a garlic peel, then it is now part of the joined water of the entire mikveh. And as you extract, even though it is technically over the airspace of the vessel, the water creates a joined barrier and the utensil is clean as it is extracted. All right, does that make sense to everyone? Okay, just double checking, leaving up here for Dr. Culp's commentary for those that are playing at home and want to read along without going to Sefaria themselves. All right, if you thought that was an unusual situation, here is our next situation. Okay, an oven. Most of us, when we think of an oven, we think of a large metal box that is somewhere in our kitchen that has a big door on the side. That is not the way ovens worked in the ancient world, in most parts of the world, but we'll focus on the ancient Near East and the land of Israel and the other places where our people lived for the time, during most of the time when the Mishnah and Talmud were being written. Those ovens came in a couple of varieties. Many of them were basically large towers or cones that would be built freestanding outside of your house, usually in a courtyard or near the house somewhere, and you would put fire in at the bottom, you would make it super hot, and then the overall oven would either be baked on the outside, slapping your bread to the exterior wall of the oven, or you would take those hot coals, push them to one side, and then put your food inside the oven chamber, inside this cone, this tower. The other types of ovens were more like a tandoori oven. The tandoor is more like a pit, and you would again burn things in it, create a lot of heat, and then you would lower things into it to cook and cover it if that was what the recipe called for. Okay, so now that you're not thinking about a metal box in your kitchen, but instead are thinking about a large clay tower, let's deal with what's going on. If water of a spring flowed forth from an oven and a man went down and immersed himself in it, he is clean, but his hands become unclean. All right, so now we've got this oven, but the oven has become flooded. Well, the oven itself is still an item that can be ritually impure. That's still a potential problem, but the water is filling it up. So what is the status? Well, if I go in, I become ritually pure. However, as a rabbinic stringency, we do say that the airspace of this terracotta item will render the hands impure. Yes, it is possible for the body and the hands to have a different purity status. The body could be ritually pure, with the hands not ritually pure according to the rabbinic reading. That's what we talked about with the whole section on Yadayim for the process of ritually purifying the hands. So the issue here is that as you come out, well, you may be clean, but your hands are immediately rendered unclean again by the airspace of the oven. But if the water was as high above the oven as the height of his hands are also impure. So again, if the water has fully immersed this oven tower to the point where your hands are able to clear the edge of the water without, clear the edges of the tower without breaking the water. So, here's the edge of the clay, my hand comes up and the water is higher still, then that's okay, right? But if the, we'll use the bottom of my Zoom if you like, if the clay stops here and the water starts here, then no, my fingers are not still in the mikvah water by the time they reach the air, then I am still connected to the airspace of the tower, and my hands will need to be ritually immersed. Now, don't worry about that. That's a very simple process. You can just re-immerse the hands in a proper part of the mikvah, which is not doesn't have this issue. But there is another way to fix all of this. If the water was as high above the oven as the height of his hands, I think I already read that, his hands are also clean. If the water is all the way up, like I said, deep enough above the tower that his hands can exit the tower space before they reach the air, then we're perfectly fine. Yes, Sarah.
And Rabbi, I know we went over this in Yadayim, but how come is this D Rabbanan or D Orta?
Oh, it's definitely the Rabbanan.
That's what I thought. Is that why the hands only become impure? Because it's similar to what we read in Yadayim?
Yadayim, exactly right.
Yadayim.
The rabbis created a special stringency with regards to the hands and created more opportunities for the hands to become ritually impure. The body can only become ritually impure by coming into contact with the primary category of ritual impurity. But the hands can become ritually impure in lots of different ways. So that's why there's more stringency here regarding the hands. But those additional stringencies are rabbinic precautions, and thus we were able to put in leniencies with regards to the hands because the stringency was already put in place by the rabbis in the first instance. Yes, sir.
Does that mean the inside of a vessel cannot be a father of impurity?
The airspace cannot be. If the vessel itself is a father of impurity, if that has somehow gained that status, then it can. But the airspace stringency would not infect a human with that type of impurity. So you could put your foot, let's just say, in and out without it being an issue, but you couldn't put your hand, of course, because then you would trip the rabbinic precaution. All right, one more drink. The tea's cooling down enough that I can drink a little bit more quickly. All right, Mishnah number 7. Back to our connection of mikvaot. And as I like to point out, the Mishnah, too many M words tonight. The Mishnah was not written to be a systematic learning process from simplest topic to most complex topic. It was written to be a useful mnemonic and helpful study guide for remembering what you'd already learned. Otherwise, Mishnah 6-7 would have come when we first began talking about joining it at the beginning of this chapter, or maybe even in a couple chapters ago. Okay. Mikvaot can be joined together if their connection is as big as the tube of a water skin in thickness and in space, which is which is when 2 fingers can be fully turned around. So here we're moving on to not connecting crevices or additional subchambers. Here we are dealing with 2 actual, regular, grown-up mikvahs. But we're going to add that you can connect them, and this tube of water skin thickness is finally going to be defined. It's 2 fingers that can be easily turned around. So that's the space that we're looking for, is just hold up your 2 fingers, put them into a hole. Can you twist them around or can you not? If you can twist them around, we're doing fine. If you can't, that's too small of a connection. The water may be touching itself, but it's not considered joined. Okay. If there is a doubt whether it is as big as the tube of a water skin or not, it is invalid, because dun, 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 this is a mitzvah from the Torah. This is deoraita. We do know that we want the mikvah to be valid. We do know that as being an important Torah idea, and therefore we will be strict on this, that if they are connecting and we are using the water that is valid in one to make the water in the other valid, then we need to make sure that it does meet this minimum requirement. And so if there is safek, if there is doubt, then we will rule stringently here and make sure that we make that opening a little bigger. Okay. As long as we're talking about, oh, go ahead, Aaron, before we get to the tangent.
Sorry, Rabbi. So what makes this one day Rabbanan? I mean, day Rotan instead of day Rabbanan?
So the basic requirement to immerse in a kosher mikvah is a deoraita requirement. The Torah tells us you need to immerse in a mikvah for many different situations. However, we are now seeing that we want to join 2 mikvahs, and as we'll see, one of them is okay and one of them isn't. So if we want to make sure that the one isn't becomes okay, then we have to make sure that a minimum measure of jointery, no, that's joinery is like woodcrafting, a minimum measure of connectivity, we'll use that, a minimum measure of connectivity, it actually exists. Now, yes, are the rabbis saying that they have seen explicitly the idea of this size in the Torah and that's what they're holding to? No. Do they believe they have derived this from the Torah and thus they need to hold to it? Yes. And so that's why this is considered a deoraita requirement, and thus when in doubt, we need to make the hole bigger or not consider them joined, and thus we can't use the secondary mikvah that we are concerned with.
Rabbi, my understanding from reading the notes that the water requirements for day Rata is much smaller than the water requirements for a day Rabbanan kosher mikvah. And that's why when we saw the 3 mikvahs, doubt went basically in favor of the mikvah being valid, or at least the same, and here doubt goes the other way.
Correct, right? Because here we're not talking, as we're going to see, just about the quantity. We're talking about the actual linkage between the 2. It's not a little bit from one goes into B, although we're going to work on that in a second, but it's more about they are becoming as though they were one giant mikvah. And so the rabbis want to be a little bit more protective of that Torah issue. Let's wait until we maybe able to clear up a little bit more when we get into the actual use case. But we have a tangent before we get to the use case of this, of linking 2 mikvahs, because right now the word mikvah is a little vague. And as we're going to see, they're going to describe it in more detail of what is right with one and what is wrong with the other. But there is this, well, it sounds like a digression, but that's because as long as we're talking about measures, let's talk about measures. The same applies, meaning about the doubt with regards to size, also to the olive's bulk of a corpse, the olive's bulk of carrion, and the lentil's bulk of a sheretz. So these are 3 other things which can cause ritual impurity. And if you're not sure whether you have come into contact with enough of one of these things to render yourself ritually impure, then we err on the side of caution. If you're like, well, I don't know, it was kind of big, but maybe not an olive, then you are considered ritually impure. Like we talked about before, this is also for private issues. If it's in the public domain, then we do err on the side of leniency. But if you were handling one of these things in private, then if you're not sure, then you would say that you are ritually impure. Now, if you are sure that it was less than, oh yeah, that was way less than an olive's bulk, then you're not ritually impure. This is not saying anything makes you ritually impure. There is a minimum measure. But if you are not sure of that minimum measure that you came into, if the part you came into contact met that minimum measure, then yes, we will err on the side of caution. And anything which remains in the space measuring the tube of a water skin lessens it. Going back to our mikvah pipe, if something begins to fill up that pipe, meaning if there is some gunk in the pipe that's gotten there, well, if it's now less than that two finger width or diameter, then I'm sorry, the mikvaot are no longer considered linked. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, if it is in any way, if it is in any water creature whatsoever, the mikvaot remain clean. So what he's talking about here is the algae and the various critters that live in the water. And his argument is, if it comes from the water, it counts as water. And if it counts as water, then the passage is still considered as open, even if it has gotten narrow because of the gunk that is now inside of it. He loses that argument. I've just warned you right now, but his underlying logic is, it came from the water, it counts as water. Okay, so now that we've got a basic understanding, let's actually use that information to make a mikveh valid that otherwise wouldn't. Here we are in 6a. Mikvaot may be made clean by joining drawn water from a higher mikveh to valid water from a lower mikveh, or drawn water from a distant mikveh to valid water in a mikveh near at hand. Okay, so we've got a picture to work with here. I'm going to describe both of them, but then we're going to settle on the first case just because it's easier to imagine. So we have mikveh A and mikveh B. Mikveh A is full of drawn water. That is to say, it is not a valid mikveh, it is just a container of water. Mikveh B, on the other hand, is full of rainwater, and mikveh B is a kosher mikveh. We want to use mikveh B to make mikveh A valid. Now notice, mikveh A is higher, and gravity is going to be our enemy here, but keep that in mind. Now, this same process will work if they are level, which is what the distant and near at hand one means, or one is there and one is closer, but they're on the same level. And it goes without saying, although the commentators all say it, that if the rainwater mikveh was higher than the lower one, then nobody needs to be told that you can make it valid, the lower one valid too, by this technique. Okay, but let's stick with drawn water is higher, rainwater in B is lower. How do we use this technique of linkage to make rainwater A, or drawn water A valid? How so? Ketzad, how do we make this happen? One brings a pipe of earthenware or of lead, or really any material that can work, and puts his hand beneath it, means cover the end of the pipe until it is filled with water. Then he draws it along till the two waters touch, even if by a hair's breadth. Okay, so I've got my mikveh A, which is with the invalid drawn water, and I stick my pipe into it, and I cover the end of the pipe. And then I lower the pipe down till it comes to mikveh B with the rainwater in it. And then I remove my hand. So there is now a water channel going from mikveh A to mikveh B downhill. And as long as that water channel is touching the water in both by at least a hair's breadth, it is considered to be one giant mikveh. It's a mikveh with two parts, an uphill part and a lower part, but this mikveh is now considered kosher in both the upper part and the lower part. So because the bottom part is a kosher rainwater mikveh, there is no amount of drawn water that can invalidate it. We can always add drawn water to a mikveh once it has reached that minimum 40 seah measure, which means once it is now touching the water container in the upper mikveh, it is as though the two of them were all linked. And since the water in the bottom cannot be invalidated, the water in the top becomes kosher for use as a a proper mikvah. Now you may be thinking, but wait a minute, water doesn't go uphill. How is this happening? What witchcraft is this? It's not about the technical flow of water. That's why they staged this hypothetical with the invalid one higher. It is about the touching. It is about the literal kissing of the two waters between these sources. And whether or not it's flowing from A to B or B to A, or just level between the two of them, doesn't matter. It's, are they now touching from the kosher one to the non-kosher one? Make sense? Okay. Let's use one more variation. If in the higher mikveh, there were 40 seyas and nothing in the lower one may draw water and carry it on the shoulder and place it in the higher mikveh until 40 seyas have flown down into the lower mikveh. Okay, so in this case, we actually have a kosher upper mikveh. So we've got mikveh A, perfectly kosher, no problem, and then mikveh B, downhill, connected by our pipe, but bone dry, totally empty. Okay, how do I fill up mikveh B, the empty one at the bottom? If I just dump water from my shoulder buckets into mikveh B at the bottom in the empty mikveh, then once I pass 3 log, it's no longer going to be a valid mikveh. I got to dry it out and start all over again with rainwater somehow. However, if I am clever, I can fill the top mikveh and the runoff will go down the pipe into the lower mikveh. And by continually filling the top mikveh, I will be able to fill both chambers with valid mikveh water. As long as that top one was 40 seyas, and we just keep going and we don't let it go down below that, the fact that I am using drawn water to essentially commingle and create a total of 80 seyas or more water doesn't invalidate the lower one. Even though technically the only reason it's getting filled at the bottom is because I added drawn water to the top, the mikveh at the top immediately assimilates the drawn water and it no longer has that status because it was a proper kosher mikveh at the beginning of the process. So we don't count molecules as they go down. We don't worry about flow rates and flow direction. As long as we started with a kosher mikveh and it has touched the water that is going to be part of the additional chamber, we are good to go. See how clever we are? Right? There's a reason why people who study these sorts of things often also enjoy studying the civil law of their country or science or the details of history or so many other subjects. It draws one to think very carefully and very systematically about things and to try and find what would be a solution, but to also recognize where it won't work, where there would be a problem that will not fit the criteria that is needed. And I find that to be personally very stimulating and enjoyable, but that is more of a historical insight than just my own personal reflection. All right, we have reached our hour point. I don't want to begin with Mishnah 6.9 because we're going to get into some more technical aspects of how they are drawn and connected. So we will leave it with Mishnah 6.8 for today, and we'll pick up with 6.9 next week. Hope everybody continues their study and finds it stimulating and enjoyable, as well as insightful for how they conduct their life Jewishly. And I will see you all next time.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.